Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the city of Bradford, a place of red brick and soot-stained stone, where the air often carries the heavy, damp scent of the Pennine Hills. It is May, in the year 2010. The spring should be bringing a softness to the streets, but the night air remains biting, clinging to the skin like a wet wool coat. Imagine the narrow corridors of the city, the yellow glow of street lamps reflecting off slick cobblestones, and the distant, rhythmic hum of a metropolis that never truly breathes in unison. We are standing outside a building on Thornton Road. It is called Homefield Court. It is a functional, unadorned apartment complex, a series of windows looking out over the industrial heart of West Yorkshire. Inside these walls, among the quiet lives of dozens of residents, a darkness has been fermenting. It is a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight, settling in the corners of the hallways and beneath the doors of the small, square flats. Close your eyes and feel the stillness of that night, the way the world seems to contract until there is only the sound of your own steady breathing and the low, constant drone of a city at rest. The morning of Monday, May 24th, began with the mundane rituals of work. A man named Peter G., the caretaker of Homefield Court, arrived at the building just as he had done many times before. The air in his small office was stale, smelling of cold coffee and the metallic tang of electronic equipment. Outside, the sky was a bruised shade of gray, typical of a northern English morning. Peter sat in his worn chair, the springs groaning softly beneath him. His task was routine, to review the security footage from the weekend. He began to scroll through the digital archives, the flickering light of the monitors illuminating the deep lines on his face. The footage was grainy, a world of washed-out grays and stark blacks, where shadows stretched across the corridors like ink spilling on a page. He watched the unblinking eye of camera number 14, which guarded the hallway on the third floor. For a long time, there was nothing but the static hum of an empty hall. Then, the screen showed a woman and a man walking toward flat number 33. The time was approximately 2:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 22nd. The woman was Suzanne Blamires, 36 years old, her movements fluid and unsuspecting. The man beside her was a resident of the building, a 40-year-old doctoral student named Stephen Griffiths. They disappeared behind his door, and for a moment, the hallway returned to its hollow, artificial peace. As Peter continued to watch, the stillness of the screen was suddenly shattered. The door to flat 33 burst open. Suzanne Blamires ran into the corridor, her figure a blurred ghost on the low-resolution tape. You can almost feel the desperation in her movement, the way her feet must have slapped against the cold, hard flooring. Behind her, a shadow emerged. It was Griffiths. He was not running with the frantic energy of a pursuer. He moved with a chilling, calculated precision. The caretaker watched, his breath hitching in his throat, as the scene unfolded in horrific silence. Suzanne reached the end of the hallway, her hands searching for an exit, a way out of the nightmare that had begun behind that closed door. But the predator was faster. In the flickering light of the hallway, Griffiths overtook her. He struck her down, a brutal, heavy blow that sent her small frame spiraling to the floor. She lay there unmoving as the man stood over her. The silence of the footage makes the violence feel distant, yet the impact is visceral. You can imagine the coldness of that corridor, the sterile smell of floor wax, and the absolute absence of any helping hand in that desolate hour of the morning. The caretaker leaned closer to the screen, his hands trembling as he manipulated the controls. What he saw next was something that defied the logic of a civilized world. Griffiths vanished back into his apartment for a fleeting moment, leaving the unconscious woman on the floor. When he returned, he was carrying a weapon. It was a crossbow, a heavy, archaic instrument of death that looked profoundly out of place in the modern hallway of an apartment block. The caretaker watched as Griffiths stood over the helpless Suzanne, the mechanical tension of the weapon visible even through the digital static. With a movement that was both swift and agonizingly slow, he aimed. There was no hesitation. The bolt was fired at close range. The violence was absolute. Afterward, Griffiths began to drag Susan's body back toward his flat by her leg, her form leaving a dark, indistinct trail along the patterned carpet. The sheer weight of the act, the coldness of the execution, seemed to vibrate through the monitor. Peter felt the blood drain from his face, the reality of what he was witnessing settling in his stomach like lead. This was not a random act of passion. It was a performance, a deliberate crossing of a line into a realm of depravity that few could even conceive. But the most haunting part of the footage was yet to come. As Griffiths reached the threshold of his apartment, he stopped. He did not look away in shame, nor did he hurry to hide his crime. Instead, he turned his head and looked directly into the lens of the security camera. He knew it was there. He had always known. With a chilling, triumphant arrogance, he raised his hand and made an obscene gesture to the camera, a middle finger extended toward the unblinking eye of the law. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered malice. His face, caught in the harsh glare of the hallway light, was a mask of cold satisfaction. He was claiming his work, inviting the world to watch the darkness he had unleashed. He then pulled the body into the flat and closed the door, leaving the hallway empty once more. The caretaker sat in the silence of his office, the hum of the computers now sounding like a scream. He picked up the telephone, his fingers fumbling with the keys, and called the police. Outside, the city of Bradford continued its morning climb into wakefulness, unaware that the secret held within Flat 33 was about to change the history of the city forever. The eye of the lens had seen everything, and now, the hunt for the man who called himself a demon was beginning. Shame or fear. Instead, he looked directly into the glass lens of the security camera, a cold and deliberate acknowledgement of his own dark theater. But to understand the terrifying confidence of that moment, we must turn back the clock to a time when the mist first began to settle over the streets of Bradford, long before the world knew the name of the man in apartment 33. The story of this darkness does not begin with a single act of violence, but with a slow, creeping silence that swallowed the vulnerable. It began on a Monday in late June, 2009. The air in West Yorkshire was heavy with the humid weight of early summer, a dull haze that softened the edges of the Victorian brickwork and the industrial chimneys of Thornton Road. Susan Rushworth, a 43-year-old mother of 3, moved through this haze with a quiet purpose. She was a woman who carried the weight of her world on her shoulders, struggling with the twin shadows of epilepsy and addiction, yet she remained a person deeply loved, a grandmother whose absence would soon leave a jagged hole in the hearts of her kin. At 11:30 in the morning on that 22nd of June, Susan boarded a single-decker bus near the Tyke pub. Imagine the rhythmic hum of the engine, the vibration of the seat against her back, and the passing blur of the city she knew so well. She stepped off the bus in the Manningham area at noon, the midday sun struggling to pierce the gray clouds. The streets were busy, filled with the mundane sounds of traffic and distant conversation, yet as Susan turned a corner and faded from the view of the world, she entered a silence that would never be broken. She simply vanished. No phone calls were made, no medication was sought for her condition, and no trace of her presence remained on the pavement she had walked for years. For months, her family waited by the telephone, the silence of the house becoming a deafening roar. Her son, James, made public appeals, his voice trembling with the desperate hope that his mother was merely lost, not gone. But while the city searched the alleyways and the hospitals, a predator was watching from the heights of Homefield Court, his mind filled with the gruesome details of the Victorian homicides he studied for his doctoral thesis. The seasons shifted from the warmth of summer to the biting chill of a northern winter, and still, there was no sign of Susan. The police investigations stalled, the leads turning into dead ends as cold as the stone walls of the University of Bradford, where the killer spent his days. He was a man of books and shadows, a student of the macabre who walked among the people of the red light district like a ghost. He was invisible because he was ordinary in his eccentricity, a solitary figure who carried a heavy bag and spoke in the measured tones of an academic. Within the walls of his flat, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of fog. Traces of Susan's blood were later found there, microscopic witnesses to a struggle that the world would not hear about for nearly a year. He had used a hammer, a tool of cold iron, to end her life, before turning to the machine tools of his trade to hide what he had done. He moved with the precision of a man who believed he was writing his own history, a scholar of death practicing his craft in the modern age. By April of 2010, the frost had finally begun to melt, replaced by the damp, biting rains of spring. On the 26th of April, another light was extinguished. Shelley Armitage was 31 years old, a woman described by those who knew her as vibrant, full of life, and possessing a personality that could fill a room. She had dreams that reached far beyond the rain-slicked streets of the city center. She spoke of becoming a model, of a future where her face was captured in soft light rather than the harsh glare of a street lamp. That Monday evening, she shared a meal with a friend on City Road, the steam from the food and the low murmur of the restaurant providing a final moment of warmth. As the clock ticked toward 10 in the evening, she moved toward Rebecca Street. The shadows there are long and deep, cast by the warehouses and the narrow passages that crisscross the district. Shelley walked with a brisk pace, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, a sound that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the night air. She was captured on a distant closed-circuit camera, a grainy, flickering ghost walking a short distance before turning back, retracing her steps into the void. The disappearance of Shelley Armitage sent a shiver through the community. Two women, both gone within a year, both from the same small circle of streets. The air grew cold with a new kind of fear, a collective holding of breath as the realization dawned that something was hunting in the mist. The man in flat 33 felt the power of this fear. He had given himself a name in the private corners of his mind, a name that would later shock the nation. The cannibal of the ballista. The word ballista, an old term for a crossbow, hinted at the medieval brutality he was beginning to favor. While Shelley's family searched the banks of the River Aire and the derelict buildings of the city, the predator was beginning to record his own deeds. He had used his crossbow on Shelley, a silent, ancient weapon that left no echo in the night. He had documented her final moments in the bathtub of his home, spray-painting words of ownership across her skin as if she were a canvas rather than a human soul. As the month of May arrived, bringing with it a deceptive bloom of flowers, the tension in Bradford reached a breaking point. The mist was beginning to lift, but what it would reveal beneath the surface of the river and behind the door of Homefield Court was a horror that no one was truly prepared to face. The fog often clings to the red brick of the University of Bradford, a damp, gray curtain that mutes the sounds of the city. Within the walls of the criminology department, the air is thick with the scent of old paper, coffee, and the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. It was here, in the late 2000s, that a man named Stephen Griffiths moved through the corridors like a ghost in a leather trench coat. He was a PhD student, a man of 40 years who had dedicated his life to the cold study of death. He did not merely read about crime, he inhaled it. He sat for hours in the quiet corners of the library, the light catching the sharp edges of his spectacles as he turned the pages of heavy, academic volumes. The rustle of the paper was the only sound in his world, a dry, rhythmic whisper that matched the calculated stillness of his posture. He was researching the dark underbelly of the 19th century, specifically the violence that had stained the cobblestones of Bradford between the years of 1847 and 1899. To his peers, he was an oddity, a shadow that didn't quite fit the light of the modern world, always draped in black, always distant, as if his mind was anchored in a different, more brutal era. His obsession was rooted in the very ground he walked upon. As a boy in Wakefield, he had attended the Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, a prestigious institution with a chilling legacy. Decades before Stephen stepped through those doors, the school had educated another man of infamy, John George Haigh, the notorious acid bath murderer. Stephen did not look upon this connection with horror. He looked upon it with a sense of dark destiny. He spent his nights immersed in the details of the past, studying how men like Haigh and the elusive Jack the Ripper had carved their names into history. His academic thesis was not just a requirement for a degree, it was a blueprint. He studied the mechanics of dismemberment and the psychological profiles of those who hunted in the shadows. To the professors, he was a dedicated, if somewhat eccentric, scholar. They saw a man fascinated by the theoretical nature of evil, never suspecting that the man sitting across from them in the seminar rooms was meticulously preparing to step out of the books and into the reality of the hunt. He was a student of murder, who was quickly becoming a master of the craft. Outside the university, in the neighborhood of Manningham, the residents knew him by a different name. They called him the Lizard Man. He lived on the top floor of Homefield Court, a weathered stone building on Thornton Road that had once served as a Victorian textile mill. The thick walls of the old factory held a cold, industrial silence that Stephen seemed to crave. He was often seen walking the nearby streets, his tall, thin frame shrouded in his signature leather coat, even when the summer sun beat down on the pavement. What drew the eyes of his neighbors, however, were the leashes in his hands. At the end of those leads were two monitor lizards, prehistoric-looking creatures that flicked their tongues at the damp Yorkshire air. He walked them as one would walk a dog, his face a mask of total indifference to the stares and whispers of those he passed. In the local pubs and shops, he was regarded as a harmless, eccentric, a peculiar man who kept to himself and his reptiles. They saw the sunglasses he wore regardless of the weather, the slicked-back hair, and the way he moved with a stiff, predatory grace, but they failed to see the predatory hunger that was beginning to consume him from the inside out. The interior of his flat at Homefield Court was a sanctuary for his dark fascinations. The walls were lined with hundreds of books on serial killers, forensic psychology, and the history of torture. It was a shrine to the very things that kept the rest of the world awake with fear. On his computer, he maintained a digital presence under the name Venpariah, a nod to the outcasts and the demons of old lore. He curated a website he called The Skeleton and the Jaguar, filled with images of crossbows and the faces of 50 of history's most prolific killers. The air in the apartment was heavy, smelling of the raw meat he fed his lizards and the metallic tang of the weapons he kept hidden in the shadows. He possessed a collection of knives and a powerful crossbow, a tool of silent, ancient lethality. In his mind, he was no longer just Stephen Griffiths, the Ph.D. candidate. He was the cannibal of the ballista, a title he had begun to whisper to himself in the quiet of the night. The line between his academic research and his personal identity had long since dissolved, leaving behind a man who viewed the people around him as nothing more than biological specimens to be studied and eventually discarded. This transformation had been years in the making. As far back as 1991, psychiatrists had examined Stephen and labeled him a sadistic schizoid psychopath. They noted his preoccupation with murder and his utter lack of empathy, a coldness that seemed to permeate his very soul. He had even predicted to a probation officer that he would one day become a serial killer, a prophecy that was ignored as the ramblings of a troubled man. But as the year 2009 bled into 2010, the prophecy began to take shape. He would sit by his window in the old mill, watching the figures move through the red light district below. He watched the vulnerable, the lost, and the forgotten, seeing them not as humans with lives and families, but as opportunities to enact the theories he had spent so long studying. The university library was no longer enough. The books were too quiet. He needed the sound of the city, the heavy dampness of the night, and the silent arc of a bolt from his weapon to complete his final lesson. The student was ready to leave the classroom behind, and the shadows of Bradford were waiting to receive him. The arrest of Stephen Griffiths on that Monday in May 2010 shifted the focus from the sterile, blood-stained confines of Homefield Court to the murky, winding waters of the River Aire. As the doors of the police van clicked shut, a new and more somber operation began 5 miles to the north, in the quiet district of Shipley. The air there was heavy with the scent of damp earth and late spring rain. Yellow police tape now fluttered against the iron railings of Otley Road, slicing through the mundane scenery of the riverside. The water itself was dark and fast-moving, a silty green ribbon that carried with it the secrets of a killer who had used the city's public transit to ferry his grim burdens. Imagine the weight of those rucksacks as he sat on the train, surrounded by commuters, the fabric resting heavily against his knees while the river waited patiently downstream. The investigation was no longer just a search for a missing person. It had become a meticulous, aquatic harvest. By Tuesday, May 25th, the banks near Dockfield Road were transformed into a clinical outpost. 2 white forensic tents stood like ghost-pale monuments against the lush green of the riverbanks. The hum of portable generators provided a low, vibrating drone that masked the natural sounds of the water. Divers from the West Yorkshire Police Underwater Search Unit arrived in heavy, black neoprene suits, their gear clanking rhythmically as they prepared to submerge into the zero-visibility depths. They moved with a slow, deliberate caution, feeling through the thick silt and tangled weeds of the riverbed. The water was cold, pressing against them with a relentless current. It was a member of the public who first noticed something out of place. A rucksack caught near the edge, partially submerged and heavy with more than just river water. When the divers finally brought the bag to the surface, the atmosphere on the bank shifted from professional focus to a profound, heavy silence. Inside that bag, the true extent of the horror began to emerge. Forensic pathologists at the scene faced a task of unimaginable difficulty. The remains were not whole. They had been subjected to a systematic and clinical dismemberment. Over the following days, the searchers would recover 81 separate fragments of Suzanne Blamires. Each piece was a testament to the cold, detached precision Griffiths had cultivated during his years of obsessive study. In the sterile light of the morgue, specialists worked to piece together the evidence, utilizing dental records to confirm what the investigators already feared. This was Suzanne. The woman who had been seen running for her life in the grainy footage of the corridor had finally been found, but in a state that defied the dignity of her memory. The search did not stop there, however. The divers returned to the water again and again, their gloved hands searching the river floor for anything else the current might have tried to hide. On Saturday, May 29th, the water gave up another significant piece of the puzzle. A black, wheeled carry-on suitcase was dredged from the river near Shipley, not far from where the first remains had been discovered. It felt unnaturally heavy as it was hoisted onto the grass. Forensic officers, draped in their white protective suits, moved in to secure the find. Inside, they did not find more remains, but rather the instruments of the crimes. Power tools, still wet and coated in fine river sediment, lay packed within the lining. These were the mechanical witnesses to the events inside flat number 33. The police allowed the tools to dry naturally and slowly, a process that took days, before they could be dusted for prints or examined for trace DNA. The presence of these tools confirmed the premeditated, industrial nature of the murders. The River Aire was being stripped of its secrets, one submerged object at a time, while the families of the missing waited behind the cordons, clutching floral tributes and watching the bubbles rise from the divers' tanks. As June arrived, the forensic net widened to include over 128 different sites across the region. Cadaver dogs worked the riverbanks, their sharp barks echoing under the bridges, while detectives from the Serious Crime Analysis section pored over the evidence. Soon, the water yielded yet another discovery. Small fragments of human tissue were recovered and rushed to the laboratory. The resulting DNA tests brought a bittersweet end to another disappearance. The remains belonged to Shelley Armitage, who had vanished in April. Only small portions of her, shoulders and vertebrae, would ever be found in the silt of the air. The river had been a cruel keeper of these women, and even as the investigation grew to 45 dedicated detectives, one name remained absent from the recovery lists. Susan Rushworth, the first to disappear in June of the previous year, remained lost. Despite Griffiths' boastful claims in custody and the exhaustive dredging of the waterways, the depths of the air refused to surrender her, leaving a hollow silence where the truth should have been. The transition from the muddy banks of the river Aire to the sterile, wood-paneled confines of the legal system felt like a descent into a different kind of darkness. By late May of 2010, the heavy scent of damp earth and river silt was replaced by the smell of floor wax and old paper. The morning of May 28th broke over the city of Bradford with a persistent, gray drizzle, the kind of rain that clings to the skin and refuses to wash anything clean. Outside the Bradford Magistrates' Court, a sea of cameras and umbrellas formed a restless tide, as journalists and onlookers jostled for a glimpse of the man who had turned the red light district into a hunting ground. Inside Court Number 3, the air was unnervingly still. The public gallery was a claustrophobic space, filled with the grieving families of Shelley Armitage and Susan Rushworth, their faces etched with an exhaustion that transcended sleep. They sat in a row, shoulders touching, a collective wall of pain waiting to see the face of the man who had occupied their nightmares for months. The silence in the room was brittle, broken only by the occasional rustle of a solicitor's gown or the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to emphasize how slowly the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. At precisely 10 in the morning, a heavy door at the side of the secure dock groaned open. 2 security officers emerged first, their movements practiced and stiff, and then came the man in the dock. Stephen Griffiths stepped into the light, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He did not look like the monster the city had come to fear. He looked mundane, almost fragile in his plainness. He wore a dark shirt and dark trousers, his skin appearing remarkably pale against the shadows of the booth. His hair, usually slicked back with a meticulous, almost oily precision, was slightly unkempt. He stood with a slight slouch, his eyes darting across the room with a hollow, vacant quality, as if he were watching a film he had seen many times before. He looked less like a predator, and more like the eccentric academic his neighbors had known as the Lizard Man. The contrast was jarring. This was the man who had spent his days at the University of Bradford, pursuing a doctorate in the history of homicide, and his nights supposedly emulating the very killers he studied. The legal machine began to hum as the clerk rose to perform the first of many formalities, her voice steady despite the weight of the charges she was about to read. The clerk looked toward the dock and asked the standard, bureaucratic question that initiates every hearing, for the defendant to state his full name for the record. The room braced for a simple identification. Instead, Griffiths paused. He reached up, his fingers trembling slightly as he scratched the side of his head, a gesture that seemed almost casually thoughtful. Then, in a flat, monotone voice that carried to the very back of the gallery, he spoke 3 words that would solidify his place in the annals of British crime. He did not say Stephen Sean Griffiths. He said, with a chilling sense of pride, the Crossbow Cannibal. The words fell like heavy stones into a deep pool. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The families of the victims went pale, some clutching their chests as if the air had been physically knocked from their lungs. An official nearby was heard to mutter a soft, disbelief-filled question, asking if he had truly heard correctly. Griffiths remained standing, his expression unchanged, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a moment of supreme narcissism, a calculated attempt to seize the narrative and ensure that he was no longer seen as a mere student of murder, but as its modern master. The clerk, recovering her composure with the stoicism required of her office, proceeded to ask for his address. Griffith's response was equally dismissive, a low-voiced quip that he supposed his address was now here, within the walls of the legal system. The brief 3-minute hearing felt like an eternity for those in the gallery. As the details of the 3 counts of murder were read out, the names of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamiers echoing in the quiet room, the reality of the violence began to settle into the wood and stone of the building. District Judge Susan Bouch sat on the bench, her face a mask of professional neutrality, as she informed Griffiths that the nature of the crimes meant they could only be dealt with at the Crown Court. He was to be remanded in custody, taken back down to the cells beneath the street to wait for the afternoon session. As he was led away, he didn't look back at the families whose lives he had shattered. He stared straight ahead, focused on the dark hallway leading back to the belly of the prison van, leaving the courtroom in a state of stunned agitation. Later that afternoon, the scene shifted to the higher halls of the Bradford Crown Court. At 2:15, a second hearing was convened to finalize the administrative transfer of the case. The atmosphere here was different. The initial shock of his self-given title had traveled through the city like a lightning strike, and the security presence was even more pronounced. This time, when asked to confirm his identity, the theatricality seemed to have subsided, replaced by a sullen compliance. When the clerk asked if he was Stephen Sean Griffiths, he replied with a simple, "I am." It was as if the demon he had conjured in the morning had retreated, leaving behind the hollow shell of the 40-year-old man who had lived among the books and shadows of Homefield Court. Outside, the public's anger was boiling over. As the prison van pulled away from the court, a man from the crowd broke through the police line, shouting abuse at the darkened windows, his voice a raw expression of the city's collective grief. Griffiths was being moved to Wakefield Prison, a high-security facility known as the Monster Mansion, where he would be housed alongside some of the most notorious killers in the country. The man in the dock had finally achieved the infamy he had studied so diligently, but the cost was a trail of blood that led directly back to his own doorstep, and a legal process that was only just beginning to uncover the full extent of the horror he had curated in the quiet of his flat. The air inside the courtroom on that 21st day of December, 2010, was thick with a cold that seemed to seep directly through the heavy, ancient stones of the building. It was a day where the sun struggled to climb above the horizon, casting nothing more than a pale, watery light through the high, arched windows. Outside, the city of Leeds was hushed by a bitter winter chill, the streets damp and gray under a sky the color of lead. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a heavy, expectant silence that felt almost physical. People sat shoulder to shoulder on the dark, polished wooden benches. Family members, journalists, and investigators who had spent many months navigating the dark, winding labyrinth of this case. The soft rustle of heavy wool coats and the occasional muffled cough were the only sounds that dared to break the stillness of the chamber. When the defendant finally appeared, he was a gaunt, shadow-like figure, his presence casting a long, dark veil over the room. There was no trace of the hollow bravado that had stained earlier hearings. Instead, there was only a chilling, vacant stillness as he prepared to hear his fate. Mr. Justice Openshaw sat upon his elevated bench, his robes a splash of somber, traditional color against the ornate, dark-grained wood of the court. When he began to speak, his voice was steady and low, carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the entire room in the absolute gravity of the moment. He spoke of crimes that were wicked and monstrous, choosing words that hung in the cold air like frost. He noted the total and chilling lack of remorse, the way the defendant had used his vast education not for the betterment of society, but as a cold, clinical map for his own descent into the deepest shadows. The sentence, when it finally came, was delivered with a quiet finality that echoed off the high ceilings. A whole life order. It was a declaration that the heavy iron gates would never open for him again. He would spend every remaining day of his existence within the gray, windowless confines of a stone cell, forever removed from the streets he had once haunted. The finality of the judge's words seemed to press down on the room, a leaden weight that signaled the end of a terrifying era for the people of West Yorkshire. As the legal machinery finally ground to a halt, the silence that followed was not for the man in the dock, but for the 3 lives that had been so cruelly and abruptly extinguished. We turn our thoughts first to Susan Rushworth. She was 43 years old, a mother of 3 and a grandmother whose face would have lit up at the simple, joyful sound of her grandchildren's laughter. Susan was a woman of remarkable resilience, someone who was fighting a quiet, difficult, and daily battle to reclaim her life from the shadows of her past. Her family remembered her fondly as Sue or Susie, a person who was always in touch, someone whose sudden absence was a gaping, painful wound that time could never fully heal. Because her remains were never recovered, there is a particular, aching quality to the silence that surrounds her memory. She remains lost to the earth in a physical sense, but she is held forever in the light of the hearts of those who loved her, a woman whose life was worth infinitely more than the tragedy that claimed it. Then there was Shelley Armitage, only 31 years old when the world lost her light. Shelley was described by those who knew her as a spirited and feisty woman, someone with a kind soul and a vibrant heart. She had a young puppy that she absolutely adored, a small, loyal creature she could never bear to be apart from for more than a few hours. This small detail made her disappearance on that April night in 2010 feel all the more haunting to those she left behind. She had been seen walking in a white cardigan, a figure in the night who deserved a long future, a warm home, and the simple, quiet peace of a morning walk with her pet. The river Aire, which flows with a cold, rhythmic pulse through the industrial heart of the city, became a place of deep sorrow when parts of her were eventually found within its dark currents. But the river also carries the memory of her name, a constant, flowing reminder of a life that was lived with energy and hope before it was cut short. Suzanne Blamiers, 36 years of age, was the final name etched into this somber history. She was a woman of immense courage, a good egg as her friends affectionately called her, someone who was known for being genuinely friendly and kind-hearted despite the many hardships she faced. It was Suzanne's final moments, captured on the unblinking eye of a silent security camera, that eventually brought the hidden darkness into the light of justice. Her bravery in those terrifying, final seconds led the way to answers for all 3 families. Her loved ones, who stood with such quiet and profound dignity through the long, grueling months of the investigation and the trial, sought only to remember the daughter and the friend she was, rather than the victim she became. In the stillness of the courtroom, as the names of these 3 women were read aloud, the heavy silence seemed to transform from a weight of grief into a protective shield around their memories, honoring the lives they led. Now, as the echoes of the trial fade and the heavy steel doors of the prison close for the final time, a different kind of silence settles over the city. The streets of Bradford and the winding banks of the river Aire remain, but the shadow that once moved among them has been cast out. The stories of Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne are not defined by the man who took them, but by the love they left behind and the justice that was finally served in that cold December hall. The night air is still now, the mist rolling softly over the Yorkshire hills, blurring the sharp edges of the world until only the distant, steady stars remain. We leave the darkness of the past behind and move toward the gentle peace of the quiet hours. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.